He promptly propped up the arrow and kicked with maximum force, deflecting it towards the archer. The arrow crashed into the archer's head with incredible force, tearing off a piece of his stone head. Jin Woo had been waiting for this moment as if he had only lived for this. He started dismembering all the stone guards, but the creator who was watching couldn't believe that Jin Woo had reached this level of development. He realized that Jin Woo had actually become stronger. Jin Woo, while blocking the guards' attacks, began to see more and more clearly all the movements of the statues that were impossible to grasp before. They were strong, but he would be able to defeat them. The creatures floating in the air and watching all of this began to tell themselves that he had really grown. However, they weren't finished yet, and suddenly, Jin Woo felt that the danger had increased. The largest stone statue in the room began to stand up, and the creator told him that it was time to chant God. A little later, a few hundred kilometers away from Jin Woo's battle with the creator in the Hunter Association, the president of the association met with the chairman of the Japanese Association. The latter began to hold out a memorandum to him that had a text written on it stating that they were giving up all the crystals from the island in favor of South Korea. However, the president of the association did not fully understand why they wanted to do this. But the president of the Japan Association began to say that they would like to hire Hunter Jin Woo in return. At this moment, a smile appeared on the association president's face and he replied to him that unfortunately this hunter did not belong to the association. But the chairman knew that it was only through them that they could contact him, and he wasn't asking for them to force him to do anything. After all, he just wanted to talk. But the president of the association thought about the fact that and only for that, they were willing to pay such a price. And it seems that with the death of Gato Ruji, they had no hunters left at all to hold back the S-rank gate. Considering how much Jin Woo's services cost, it's not a bad deal. But the president of the association pushed that sheet back and started telling him that he would like to talk to him alone without interpreters. But the chairman couldn't believe that the president of the association knew Japanese, and he replied that when he was a child, his father had run his own business in Japan. And as soon as everyone left that room and the doors were closed, the president of the association began to tell the chairman that if he was up to something again, he had better drop the idea at once. But the chairman didn't understand what the president of the association was saying. But the president went on to say that rumors had reached him that they were now in a rather strained relationship with the nude blades. But the chairman at this point jumped up and started raising his tone at the association president. This didn't stop the association president though, and he went on to say that nude blades had turned out to fund the association, and it wasn't hard to guess what was going on, because that's where it was originally going. Hand in hand with the Japanese association, but due to the death of Goto Ruji, who had control over all the S-rank hunters, now they are not easy to manage, and the naked blades are now on the verge of collapse. And the rest of the guilds are busy mopping up the gates, and must be having a hard time. If monsters get out of that gate that opened in the middle of Tokyo, then all the responsibility will fall on the chairman's shoulders. The president of the association began to tell him that apparently Gato Ruji was an outstanding hunter of their country. Although he didn't agree to this raid because of the best of intentions, it was their fault for taking Gato away from the naked blades. The chairman is responsible for splitting up the guilds and now not being able to control them. And he alone is responsible for trying to cheat back then. The chairman saw that the president of the association had placed a black box on the table that wasn't a real black box, the same one that was in the gear used by Ruji's team. At this point, he started to get very angry and told the chairman that since they thought he wouldn't find out about it. The chairman saw the atmosphere heating up and the president of the association was very angry. He continued to talk about what to do without even mentioning the crystals. We are talking about ordinary citizens. If they thought about what would become of them if these recordings were made public, the president of the association, because he was very angry, broke the transmitter and the table that was right between them. The president said there's some kind of heartless, fat leck out there and he doesn't need this. He's not going to get the whole country up in arms over one man's other intentions. After all, they can't risk their reputation and all its allies. They should thank Hunter Jin Woo for that. He fought against the huge guards, and as soon as he destroyed a few statues, others would immediately appear in their place. He realized that there was no end to them. Then he noticed a huge statue behind him that was larger than all the previous ones. He realized that he wouldn't be able to dodge it. In desperation, he used the ruler's touch skill. The statues that were chasing him began to rise into the air thanks to this technique. But before the huge statue could shoot out its eyes, those statues that were in the air melted from the force of this powerful attack. The notification system showed that his ruler's touch skill had reached its maximum level, and the ruler's power skill was now available to him. While the attack and the big statue kept getting stronger and stronger, and those stats simply melted and their powerful attack flew near the hunter Jin Woo, who managed to dodge. He realized that it was very dangerous. And if he was hit by such an attack, no skills will help him here, and he realized that first he had to deal with the big guy who shoots. Jin Woo started to use the sprint skill and jumped into the air to get to that big statue, but it didn't stand still and started to lift its big foot to slam Jin Woo, and as soon as there was a loud sound of that big foot slamming into the ground, the statue started to smile because it realized that she realized that she had finally killed the hunter, but suddenly she started to notice that her feet were moving with a bright light in the other direction. After a powerful impact, where there was smoke, Jin Woo began to appear, moving higher and higher with all his speed. He ran towards the statue, heading towards its head, and realized that it was attacking again with its large and powerful eyes. However, at this moment, Jin Woo began to combine sprint and lord power to get into the blind spot. And when the statue had already started firing its lasers, it was in the blind spot. Although the last strike wasn't delivered, Jin Woo realized that it was incredible as it almost didn't touch the statue. However, the effect of this combination was simply amazing, and he thought that if his skills were a little better, the result would have been even more impressive. Suddenly, the statue noticed the hunter standing on its shoulder, ready to deliver his crowning blow with the Chaos Blade. But as soon as the attack was over, Jin Woo realized that he had merely scratched him with a dagger that could cut through anything. He realized that since it didn't work, he would just break this statue. Jumping off the shoulder, he began to move towards the statue's face and noticed in the air that the slit in its face was the most suitable place. As he got closer to it, he hit the crack with force with a shout, "Now break it!" Damn you, creator! Still watching what was happening, the creator knew that he wouldn't be able to resist it, but Jin Woo's attack was incredible, and the huge statue began to fly aside. For he had decided to show the full power of his 103rd level. After a loud and violent impact, the statue finally lost its balance and began to fall to the ground. As soon as it fell, a loud echo resounded in the room. Jin Woo was already on Earth, and the guards that were there as well began to notice him and run to destroy him. But Jin Woo was unwilling to stop. He began to use his Power Lord abilities, and all the statues began to fall to the ground as if gravity was against them. Naturally, the guards' methods were useless, and Jin Woo clenched his fist, realizing that he had become much stronger. The creator who was watching all of this started clapping his hands and telling him that it was commendable. Jin Woo decided that he should now tell everything as he had promised, but lo and behold, the creator answered him that the exam, after all, had Jin Woo forgotten about him. And at this moment, the emergency quest and the last test were revealed. It was the creator, and Jin Woo began to read what the notification system was showing. His heart would stop if he couldn't overpower the opponents within a certain time, and the remaining time was 10 minutes. At that moment, just as the meter started going, Jin Woo asked him a question and asked him who he was, but the creator told him that he had already told him that it was a stupid question. But suddenly his mask began to crumble on his face and he decided to answer that question that he was the creator of the system. Outside the gate, the hunters from the association arrived. As soon as they approached the gate, the girl who was waiting for them began to tell them to come to her as soon as possible. At the head of the association was the inspector, who was pondering how they had managed to gather the 7 best hunters available at the moment so quickly. He feared, however, that it might not be enough to help Hunter Jin. The boys had only been brought in for backup. As the inspector got even closer to the gate, he began to feel a strange energy, not realizing what it was. He began to tell the other hunters about his sensations and asked if they felt something similar, like an icy shower. The aura enveloping him was a terrible magic to him. He began to turn around and ask the others if any of the larger ranked hunters were around. He was told that the Hunters Guild was holding a raid today and there were 2 S-rank hunters participating. The inspector began to tell them to send an urgent message immediately. "Have them get here immediately," he said. The inspector was agitated and didn't understand what Hunter Jin Woo was doing here. But at this time, Jin Woo was about to slay the strongest monster he had ever encountered. With a terrifying might in front of him, the monster creator instantly turned its wings into 6 arms. Jin Woo watched him. However, in the same second, he did not notice the creator disappeared from his sight and then suddenly attacked Jin Woo. He was so fast that he threw a strong punch, which made Jin Woo fly off to the side. Jin Woo crashed into the wall behind him, and the blow was so strong that he began to bleed. However, it didn't take long for the creator to get hurt and immediately continued to attack. But Jin Woo was already prepared for it and began to dodge his swift attacks. In an instant, Jin Woo was able to block all of his attacks, and the creator was very surprised by this, for he realized that Jin Woo had surpassed all of his expectations. And at the same moment, the creator struck Jin Woo's face with his large hand. Soon after, he began to smile eerily, but Jin Woo didn't want to stop either. He moved furiously and punched the creator back with all his might. From the impact, the creator flew off to the side. When he stopped, he began to say that it was unbelievable, because he didn't think he would be so excited about fighting a human. Yeah, what's there? The very fact that someone like that wouldn't be his opponent, he still can't get his head around it. The creator was very curious, but Jin Woo was already across from him and thought about the fact that this type had called him here as soon as he reached level 101. Apparently, he had intended to take him down from the start, but decided that he would survive and started telling the creator that he had 100 questions. Like why he created this system and why he chose him to be the player, and what was going on with his world. But the creator started to run towards the hunter and said that if he wanted to get answers to the questions so much, and if he was afraid that by killing him he wouldn't be able to get to the truth. Jin Woo realized that he couldn't defeat him at such a short distance, and he began to run to the side. At this moment, the Lord but creator realized that he was going to attack him from afar. And as soon as the explosion sounded, Jin Woo realized that he could use the same skills as him. Then there was no point in this plan, but the creator started to say that it didn't matter whether he would kill him or not, because his answer was already predetermined from the moment he created the entire system. But Jin Woo started to ask him questions. What was it? He had created this system, and how was he able to give him such power? But the creator answered him that he wasn't the one who chose him, for he didn't like him at all back then. He had only created and started the system to develop the player. Jin Woo looked at the timer and realized that he had almost no time left now, and the creator was already in the air at this moment and began to say that until the timer counted down the last few minutes until his death, he would fight him at full strength. And as soon as the creator began to strike with the items he had picked up, Jin Woo felt something and eventually realized that he could feel again, and now he would succeed. After all, the sword, spear, blade, axe, and hammer, he can feel them. He feels their every move, and the creator couldn't believe that he dodged despite the fact that he was hitting with all his might. Yes, it also accelerated to such a speed that he didn't notice it at all. And as soon as Jin Woo cut off his stone hand, the creator realized that even though it was a fake body, he could still feel the pain. And of course, he eventually realized that this was the reason why he was chosen, and the creator started frantically screaming that he was only human, and that was utter insolence. And at this point it was already 3 minutes and 45 seconds on the timer, at which point all the statues that were on the ground started to rise. But Jin Woo didn't stopping, because he wanted to make it before the timer ran out and he could defeat him. Right now, there was one big statue and a bunch of small ones in front of him, and at the head of them was the creator, Jin Woo. He jumped into the air and activated his Lord Power skill. At that moment, he struck the ground with force, causing all the guards to scatter in different directions. Jin Woo ran towards the creator and came close, starting to attack him. Little by little, he cut off the creator's stone arms. But suddenly, something hit his shoulder hard. And as soon as he turned around, he saw a large guardian with a great stone shield in front of him, and he realized that it was once again the creep that had once attacked him. But the timer was still running, and Jin Woo didn't want to stop. He jumped up and struck it in the head with all his strength, causing the stone guardian's head to split apart. There were about 2 minutes left to finish, but Jin Woo didn't give up and continued to cut off the stone creator's arms. Eventually, he was able to pin him to the ground, and the creator told him that he had lost. The creator started to say that all the answers he wanted to know were stored inside him. But Jin Woo didn't understand what he meant. However, the creator continued to say that now the choice was only his, and a notification appeared in front of him that the data collection process had been completed. He needed to accept or reject the information he wanted. Jin Woo thought about the fact that all the information he so desired was right in front of him right now, and he replied that he was accepting. And at that moment, a bright light appeared and all the data was successfully transferred. And Jin Woo found himself in some strange place. He was floating in the sky like a spirit and watched as many different monsters walked in one direction. He couldn't believe his eyes, because there were so many demons and monsters below him, and they all started to raise their heads and look up. Jin Woo thought that they were all looking at him, but as soon as he himself looked up, he saw a huge gate in front of him that started to open in different places. It was crowded with monsters, and suddenly he realized that this was Earth. Ice elves, high orcs and goblins, if they all made it out of the dungeons, humanity would be finished. However, their enemy was far above the humans, and things were finally coming to a head. Now he knew exactly what awaited them. And it was a bloody war, and to defeat the enemy in the form of silver warriors and monsters, decided to unite among themselves. Thus began a bloody battle, accompanied by the incessant clanging of metal against metal, and the spells that once flew out of their mouths were replaced by furious screams. Moreover, the ground was turning scarlet in color, and without a doubt the silver warriors were strong. But when it already seemed like all the monsters were about to disappear, the heaven's messengers who had previously headed towards their enemy suddenly began to retreat. Jin Woo noticed someone in black robes begin to speak for all the dead to rise, and he realized that it was the monarch lord. Mistakes that came out of nowhere summoned shadows. Jin Woo realized that that warrior in black armor was a shadow lord. He was sitting on his mighty horse, and he had an immortal army. Now the monsters had no fear of death, and surrounded by darkness, they were building up their power. While the blood in their veins only grew thicker and blacker, there was no end to them. Compared to this countless army, his army seemed insignificant, thought Jin Woo. And the monsters that had just fallen were once again coming back to life to fight the silver warriors with renewed vigor. An incredible battle between light and darkness unfolded, such that the earth itself trembled under the power of these two elements. Gradually, the fading flames of war flared up with renewed vigor, and there was only one creature who could change the outcome of the battle. Jin Woo, who was watching all of this from on high, saw the true strength of the Lord. After all, the shadow soldiers were unrelenting in destroying the silver warriors, gradually turning them into his companions. Wherever the Lord stepped foot, a veritable storm would pass, and the victory of the monsters meant the victory of the Lord. That was until they appeared. But at the same time, the hunter from the association who had entered the double dungeon to help Hunter Jin Woo was standing in front of the door. The inspector from the association asked one of the hunters if he could open those doors. But that hunter looked at them and felt a powerful magic. He began to ask the inspector that indeed Jin Woo was behind those gates. But the inspector answered him that it was confirmed information. Huntress Cha watched and realized that that magic did not belong to Jin Woo. She wondered who possessed it. After all, she never thought that she would ever see it. But no matter what, she wants to help Hunter Jin Woo. After all, that time he said he couldn't clear that double dungeon, and the inspector was wondering why he came here again, and he was sure it was for a reason. But once the door started to open, none of the hunters saw what the hell was going on inside. The inspector saw those statues and the deity and realized that they really existed. But suddenly at that moment the creator began to address them and ask how they were here, for he did not remember calling people. And it was an unexpected encounter for him. The hunters who saw this monster could not believe that it could talk and knew their language, but the creator began to tell the hunters to be quiet, or if they made so much noise, they would wake up the king. Suddenly, the hunters saw Jin was standing in one place and somehow strangely lit up. They couldn't understand what was happening to him, but at the same moment, the four hunters died at the hands of the creator. And as soon as the creator had dealt with them, he began to say that he would not take weaklings. He wanted only the strong, though even those would not be enough as a sacrifice for the king. Jin Woo was currently in a trance as he watched the Dark King fight against the monsters that came out of the Red Gate. Their numbers were countless and stretched for several hundred kilometers. After these monsters, terrifying creatures began to come out, one of which was very large and had white coloring. All of the monster troops looked into the eyes of the Dark King who was standing with his army, and they were already ready to fight. At the same time, while Jin Woo was watching this inside the room where he was in a trance, the hunters who went in there were fighting with the large statues. Some of the hunters were severely injured and needed treatment. One of the hunters started shouting to his comrades to strengthen their defenses as much as possible, as the enemies were already advancing. The creator standing in front of them began to address them and ask who would be able to come forward after the battle with his puppets. He would grant the rarest opportunity to witness the birth of a king if anyone survived such an ordeal. One of the hunters began shouting for the others to retreat, as the largest guardian was ready to fire his lasers. He fired his lasers at the hunters. There was a huge explosion, and the laser began to vaporize everything in the room. But the hunters started to bounce back, thus attacking back. One of the hunters began to use his magic and shot back at that large guardian. While one of the hunters was distracting the god, he ordered the other hunters to deal with the smaller guards who began to surround them. At that moment, an inspector from the Hunter Association flew towards one of the guards and, after gaining strength, struck him on his large helmet in one powerful blow. He thought he was going to kill the guard, but suddenly realized that he hadn't even injured him, as the guard was stronger than he thought. The hunters realized that these guards were unusual defenses, and everyone should be on guard. After all, not even magic works on them, and they are likely susceptible to it. The huntress' provocation also had no effect on them. They didn't even move even a millimeter after the numerous attacks made by the hunters. One of the hunters began to wonder if there was any way to defeat these creatures. Suddenly, he noticed Jin was standing off to the side and decided that he should wake him up since he might be in a trance right now. The hunter launched one of the fireballs at him, and it didn't matter to him whether it hit him or not. The most important thing was to wake him up, for it was the last chance they had at the moment to survive. However, as the orb came closer and closer to the hunter Jin Woo, the hunter noticed that his orb was about to be repelled by the creator, who rushed over with incredible speed. And as soon as he reflected the orb, he began to fly with words towards the hunter, shouting at him how dare he disturb the king's sleep. But suddenly the hunter was saved by his companions, who the three of them began to attack back at the creator. And at that moment, one of the hunters started shouting Hunter Cha for her to wake up Hunter Jin Woo as soon as possible while they distract the creator. She realized this and started running to the side to get as close to the sleeping Jin Woo as quickly as possible. And just as she almost reached her goal, we are shown that Jin Woo is now in another world and watching numerous monsters fight against the shadow monsters and the King of Darkness. It was an incredible sight for him, as so many had already fallen, but he continued to replenish his army, and if it were him, he would have exhausted all of his mana long ago. But there was no end to this power, and the different sides of the barricade were now fighting against one common enemy, the Shadow Soldiers. After all, if this battle was only between monsters and silver warriors, then the latter would certainly not have to fight the Shadow Army. As it was, the Shadow Warriors were fighting against the monsters, which meant that there was an internal conflict. And once the battle was over, the last of the monsters who was in charge of them was left, and the King of Darkness was approaching him saying that they were finally able to end this war. He began to ask him why he had betrayed him, but that monster replied that it was a great pity since he wanted to kill him so badly. However, the King of Darkness asked again why he craved it, and that monster began to laugh furiously and speak in some incomprehensible language. But the King of Darkness, without thinking for a long time, took him by the neck and began to lift him into the air. And the King of Darkness of Europe finished him off, but suddenly he saw that look in Jin Woo, who was now in the place of the King of Darkness, started to take the helmet off that monster and realized that it was the Demon King Baron. She was wondering what he was doing here. Suddenly, Jin Woo looked at her hands, which were stained with the monster's blood. Suddenly, he didn't realize what was happening. After all, he hadn't noticed it before. One of his hands began to touch his chest and he realized that he currently had two hearts, one human and the other dark heart, from which came an incredible power. And as soon as he raised his head, he saw silver knights flying in the sky in front of him. And at that moment, the data download was complete. The creator who was standing in front of the huntress sneered and started telling her that she was a very interesting person. He would even say she was funny. Let her try to surprise me again, he thought. The huntress decided to demonstrate her sword dancing skill and the creator liked it. He smiled and began to fight her. However, this battle did not last long. Suddenly, he wounded her shoulder and began to say that this was all she was capable of. This came as a great disappointment to him as he thought that she was just as boring and uninteresting as all the other people. Now all of them must clearly follow his planned scenario, for the hunters will not be able to stop the immortal creature. The creator kept saying that he seemed to have greatly overestimated the hunters who were trying to do anything at all against such big ferocious monsters. But one of the hunters started telling the others that they needed to wake up Hunter Jin Woo as soon as possible, as they had no other choice right now. Hunter Cha started running with all her might towards the hunter before the creator noticed him, but it was too late and the creator wanted to destroy her at that very moment. But she reacted in time and rushed to the side. The creator didn't have time to grab him, smiling as she dodged him quickly, and he realized that she was satisfied. Such a good thing. And suddenly he noticed that there was a shadow in the huntress, and according to the rules no one could enter or leave here. But it seems that the king had introduced one of his soldiers to her, and he started to ask him how they got here and what their relationship with Jin Woo was. But she answered him that they are friends and she along with the others came here to save him. The creator realized that they had come here of their own free will, and decided to give them another chance. For today, in these chambers, the greatest event would take place, the birth of a king. and he will let them witness this rare moment with their own eyes. As for the rest of us, we don't need them and he'll just kill them. But suddenly, the creator heard Jin Woo's voice asking him who had decided that. And as soon as the creator turned his head, he saw Jin Woo punch him in the face with all his might, causing him to fly off to the side. And he started to say what he had done to him. And once the other hunters saw that Jin Woo had finally woken up, they began to look on with surprised faces as he beat up the creator. And at that same moment, they sighed, for now the moment would come when they would be saved. Jin Woo stood in line beside the beaten and fallen creator, and he didn't understand why he wasn't the king. He also didn't understand why it was him and not the king standing in front of him right now. Despite having a black heart in his chest, he was able to preserve himself. However, Jin Woo thought about his words about the black heart and realized that it meant a huge flow of mana coming from him. This was the title of a demon hunter. Now that he has recovered the lost memories of killing the demon king Baron, he is recognized as the master of great power. The black heart effect gives him an additional 100,000 mana. Jin Woo noticed the creator's reaction and could say with certainty that firstly, the black heart was clearly not part of his plan, and secondly, it was at least meant to destroy him. Those memories he had seen were only a small part of what he was about to learn. Jin Woo began to ask the creator questions about why he was against his candidacy as a player. He wanted the creator to explain what a player was and what he wanted to do with him. However, the creator started to get even angrier and jumped up yelling about the Shadow Lord. I wonder if he thought the other monarchies would forgive him for this? But Jin Woo began to act more seriously, and near his body, large blades began to appear from the portals, heading towards the creator. Jin Woo told him to answer the question, but the creator started talking and smiling in response, that he had exceeded his expectations, and he seemed to understand why he had been chosen as a player. It was at this point that the hunters noticed that the statues that were just standing there and watching began to move. The creator began to say that if he killed him, he would be finished, because these statues would not stop, and suggested that Jin Woo should consider his actions. But Jin Woo started to tell him that if he could kill 2 birds with 1 stone, and the creator laughed after these words and started to say that if he killed him, the creator of the system, he would become an E-ring hunter again. But Jin Woo began to smile. He wondered, what if he killed the system creator who was already working? Nothing would happen to it, would it? He asked the question to the creator that was lying in front of him, but suddenly the creator wanted to log in and started saying that if he did so, he would die. However, the notification showed that the login for the system administrator was blocked, and he didn't understand why the system was reacting to him like that. In front of him was the real hunter Jin Woo, and he realized that the system was not using him by accident. It was a failure, but rather a pre-planned action. Then he decided to use the system and capture it. It seems that the creator's system is far from perfect. When the creators wanted to shout that he was a scum, Jin Woo cut him in half. And the last thing the creator said was about the appearance of pillars of fire that would rise into the sky, prophesying imminent death. But Jin Woo turned around and told him that no matter what, he would be ready for it. Outside the gate, where all the hunters who were guarding the entrance from the Hunter Association were standing, they realized that it had already been an hour since the members of the Hunter Guild had entered this dungeon. They were curious as to what was going on there. After all, if they entered it too, they would most likely be in trouble. But suddenly, they noticed that someone had started to return from this dungeon, and what they saw horrified them. The best members and strongest guilds of their country were in such a terrible state. They didn't understand what could have happened there. The inspector from the association began to tell the members if they could help them carry out the bodies of the dead hunters. Jin Woo, who was the last one to come out, pondered over the fact that it seems like that wasn't the creator's real body. It was somewhere else, and he still hadn't gotten any answers to his questions. But it didn't seem like he was going to tell him anything. And just as he started to move further away, the inspector who was at his back started telling him that almost 20 hunters above the mountains had died, and he was afraid to imagine what would have happened if those things had gotten out. The inspector asked Hunter Jin Woo, was he really able to stand up to them alone? But Jin Woo only thought that although he had asked the Bravo Guild to send a message to the association about the opening of the double dungeon, he didn't think that anyone would actually come to help. And in the end, so many people died. He started to tell the inspector that they only survived because of the members of the monitoring squad and the Hunters Guild. But the inspector started to reply to him that his department monitors all the activities of S-ranked hunters. However, he decided to ask the Hunters Guild for help, and this is how it turned out. Suddenly, the inspector started to ask Jin Woo how he knew that a double dungeon had opened here. But he heard back that it had called him here on its own because he had received a message that he needed to report here. But the inspector wanted to see the message with his own eyes. But Jin Woo began to tell him that the message, well, no, it was in his head, only he could see it. The inspector wasn't sure if he was joking. After all, so many people had died. But suddenly, Hunter Cha came up and asked Jin Woo if he was okay. He replied that he seemed fine, but suddenly he started leaning sideways, and as soon as he started to say that he might be a little tired, he collapsed on the ground, and everyone who was nearby started running over to him. At this time in Japan, a bunch of trucks were bringing magic crystals to a large portal that had recently opened. Yuri Orlov, who was a national-level hunter, was standing there watching it all. He saw that about 200,000 tons of magic crystals had arrived and decided to channel the energy of the magic crystals into a barrier that he would set up around the gate. And after that he would suck out all the necessary mana himself. But suddenly Yuri Orlov noticed something strange, and it was not a barrier, but that it looked like someone was watching them. Suddenly he turned around and started shouting, "Who is he? Stop hiding, let him come outside." The man who was standing near him didn't understand if he really thought there was someone left here, because already tomorrow the gate would open. But Yuri Orlov answered him, "Who said it was a person?" But that man, Jin Woo, who was standing on one of the buildings, understood that this hunter was very well developed and realized that considering how he got his power, there was nothing strange about it. And anyway, it didn't matter so much now, he decided, because the show was starting and everything was going clearly according to the script. After all, this is how everything was predicted in that terrible tragedy. At this time, the hunters who were near the portal did not understand why the government had called soldiers here, because modern weapons are practically useless against monsters. But another hunter replied that if Yuri Orlov died, they would at least buy some time for the hunters to prepare for the attack. But the girl knew that they would still become cannon fodder. But the third hunter answered her that they were no different in that. It only proved how helpless humans were in the face of disaster. Yuri Orlov watched as he got closer and closer to the entrance of the portal, and it was great for him that there were a lot of magic crystals around. If everything went clearly according to plan, he would be able to clear this gate himself. He started to tell that guy that it would be great if he could be dubbed as the person who was able to clear the S-rank gate by himself. But unfortunately, there was already a more suitable hunter for that title. A man who was standing near Yuri Orlov saw him pull alcohol out of his pocket, to which Yuri Orlov replied that he needed to relieve some tension and he was toast and would give him a real show. Before he had a drink, he started asking the man how many top-rank hunters there were in total. To which the man replied that there were 15. Yuri Orlov began to say that this was a small crowd for him and asked where, in fact, the Americans were. Didn't they send hunters to help them? But the man started to say that another gate had opened in the world, and not just in Japan, but in the Gospel of India. And indeed, all over the world. Yuri Orlov realized that they were probably short of people right now. But suddenly the gate began to open, and at the same time, the eyes of Jin Woo, who was lying in a hospital bed, opened. And at this time, Jin Ho walked through the door and immediately started sobbing and asking his master why he was only waking up now. After all, they really thought he was dead, and he had been sleeping for 3 whole days. He was very worried about his mentor. But Jin Woo began to reflect on the fact that he had slept for 3 days, and it was because he was so well exhausted. And on top of that, it's been so long since he's had a proper rest. But more importantly, he can't forget what he saw back then. If he slept for 3 days, he abruptly asked Jin Ho what happened. But the latter didn't understand anything about what he was talking about. He was talking about the appearance of the S-rank dungeon in Japan, but Jin Ho turned away and started to tell him that as soon as the gate opened, huge giants started appearing there. No hunter could believe their eyes after seeing such a perversion. Usually there are bosses in dungeons above rank A, but for Yuri Orlov it was nothing. He started using his skills and yelling at the giants to attack, and all the magic crystals started to rise into the air. And a barrier started to appear that surrounded all the gates, and one of those monsters hit the barrier with his big axe. But Yuri Orlov started laughing and told him that he didn't think he would see such monsters from a dungeon of that rank, and he didn't believe that they would actually be able to break through his barrier. But suddenly some large hand began to appear in the gate, and at one moment an even more enormous giant appeared from that gate and pushed that smaller giant towards Yuri Orlov. He watched all this and could not understand what had happened, for his eyes were frightened by the fact that the big giant had cut his barrier in half with a single blow. Jin Woo eventually realized that the raid had failed. At this time, Jin's father, Ho, was sleeping in his office. When he woke up, one of his underlings came up to him and asked him how long he had slept. He replied that he had slept 23 hours and 46 minutes, and that if he had slept a little longer, he would have been taken to the hospital. He then proceeded to tell me that he had two pieces of news. The first piece of news was that one of the people who contracted the disease with Jin had awakened. It turned out to be the mother of Jin Woo's hunter. However, this was unbelievable to them, because they didn't realize that he could even cure such a disease. The second piece of news was that guests had arrived. Jin Woo and the girl who walked in the door started asking him how come he was sick. At this time in Japan, a huge giant grabbed the hunter Yuri Orlov and devoured him. The artillery that was on the ground and the people in tanks who were shooting at the giants that came out of the gate could do nothing to them. After all, they were so powerful that no shell could harm them. The hunters on the ground began to tell the people that these weapons were useless against magical monsters. At that moment, Jin began to order his hunter friends to deal with those who came out of the portal, and altogether they pounced on one of the giants. The katana girl flew and realized that she needed to deprive this monster of its sight. But suddenly this monster noticed them and swung his big axe. The hunters realized that for his size, he moves pretty fast and he's pretty damn strong. The reporters who were at the helicopter started broadcasting live from Tokyo and said that even from a bird's eye view they could see what a horrible spectacle was unfolding before their eyes. Jin watched it all from his home on TV and realized that it was like hell on earth. And now the whole world is waiting with a frozen heart for the outcome of this battle, where the hunters are trying their best to prevent disaster. If things continue in the same vein, there's a good chance that the Jeju Island incident will happen again. And then all of Asia could be in great danger. He wondered if he should intervene, but suddenly he heard his sister's voice coming from behind the door and started telling him to stay and not to go there. He asked her again, does she really want him to stay? But he heard her start to say that he would go anyway. But what she didn't expect was for him to get up out of his chair and start saying that he kind of wasn't going to, since so much had happened lately, to rest. He walked past her, stroked her head and told her she wasn't worried about it. A little later, he sat in a nearby park and summoned his shadow, which had a shoreline in it. He started to tell her what he had rewatched Korean doramas while he was looking after Jin. Maybe he shouldn't tell him since it was already clear? He asked her how his sister was doing, to which she replied that it was nothing much, she was sleeping on her bed as usual. Jin realized that it seemed like that incident had traumatized her a lot, and in all the 4 years she had never tried to put it down yet. He didn't realize what he should do, but suddenly he saw some car approaching him. A little later, he was sitting in one of the buildings and started asking those people what they needed him to do. To which Jin Ho's father started telling him that his name was Yu Manhan and he was the chairman of Yujin Construction Company. At this moment, Jin Woo saw him holding out a check to him with the words that he was not the kind of person who believed that money could buy anything, much less a rank hunter like him. Therefore, his thoughts are completely pure. He hopes that the hunter will understand him. Jin Woo realized that it seems like today's conversation should remain just between the two of them, and from the looks of it, he wasn't going to replace him in his guild. So he began to ask what they wanted him to do. To which the man started to say that he actually has the same disease as his mother. Jin Woo started asking him if Jin Ho knew about it, to which the father replied that no, only 3 people knew about it, his wife, his attending physician, and his secretary. And apparently, he is now among them as well. He started to say that while they were looking for a cure for this disease, someone was found who was able to be cured of it. And to be honest, he's not sure if it's a matter of luck, because that person happened to be his mother. So he's right, and he needs something from him if he's going to help. He'll never forget his kindness, and Jin will realize that he might have to make a choice today. The battle in Japan was monstrous, and reporters who flew in a helicopter filmed the whole nightmare. They saw big giants tearing down buildings, ripping out trees, and it was as if these things wanted to wipe out all of humanity. What was even more horrible was that these monsters were eating people, and those in the helicopter realized that if they panicked and if they didn't touch them, they were in no danger, because they were now in the air. And they noticed that only that giant was the problem, and while the others were tearing down everything around them, the one alone was protecting the gate, as if he was waiting for someone or just guarding the entrance. But they didn't realize that. Why? But the cameraman started to say that it was certainly his guess, but it looked like it wasn't alive, and this giant was definitely breathing and even moving. But it felt like it had been programmed for another. The helicopter's passenger answered him that if it was that simple, he'd long ago gone blind from the impact of a regular shell, and they'd only destroyed 2 monsters the whole time. There were about 30 of them in total. They wondered how long it had been since they left the bunker, but the operator was keeping track of time and answered him that it had been about 2 days. It was still interesting how long they would be able to contain those monsters. After all, the city was gradually turning into ruins. But at this time, Jin Woo was in his office talking to Jin Ho. He was telling him that he wanted to go to Japan, but Jin Ho was against it and started talking about how he doesn't follow the news at all, as there is a horror happening there that surpasses what is happening in Jeju Island. He also said that he had never fought such huge monsters, but Jin Woo replied to him that he understood, but if things worked out, their guild could become famous. He continued to look at Jin Ho and couldn't believe that even someone who had always supported him was now doubting him. It seemed that the disaster was indeed of very serious proportions. However, Jin Ho suddenly realized everything and started saying that he would go with him since the Red Gate incident on Jeju Island and the Double Dungeon incident united them. He raised his hands, showed the picture and started crying that he wasn't there. Correct the text for errors, because he can only brag about working together with his mentor, and he's really scared to say it. But to the whole guild he started shouting that he's his hero and Jin Woo despite his tears. Didn't expect to hear that from the rich kid's mouth. Jin Ho started telling him that this is why he wants to help him wherever he goes and started asking him to take him along. But Jin Ho started to question him. After all, he kind of talked him out of it and now he wants to go there himself and asked him one last time, not exactly the same thing. Now they are talking and Jin Ho said with a serious face that he trusts his mentor and if he thinks it's best, then it is. But Jin Woo got up and started to leave and lastly told him that he was joking, because what the hell does he care about Japan? And lastly he said that was it for today, because they had done a great job and it was time to rest. But as soon as he left the office, he reflected on the fact that he couldn't use his shadow soldiers then, but the creator was about the same level as him, 100. So, there were still those who could easily match his strength after all. The world is a big place, and somewhere, there's bound to be someone who can defeat him. And it's time to accept that he can't solve all the problems alone, because he's not a hero. As soon as Jin Woo opened the door, he told his mom that he was home. His mother, who looked out from around the corner, started telling him that she was happy to see him and offered to have dinner. When they sat down at the table, he asked where her sister was, but his mother replied that she said she had no appetite eating at the table. Jin Woo began to remember what he had told Jin Ho's father, that he couldn't help him. And when he asked him to at least tell him how his mother recovered, Jin Woo started to say that if he knew, he wouldn't keep quiet. If he knew the reason and wanted to make money from it, he would have done it long ago. And after saying that, he turned around and started to leave. As he walked down the elevator from the 28th floor, he thought about the fact that this was his father after all, and something was bothering him. But still he didn't know the man. What kind of man was he, and what was his purpose? Maybe he wasn't sick at all, but was plotting something. After all, the amount of holy water of life was limited, so he should use it wisely. The offer was unexpected, but it didn't interest him, and he realized that since he had to make a choice, he would make it now. He started to tell his mom that he would be right back, for he realized that there were those who were stronger than him, but that didn't mean he should stop there. So now he has to go there, and he has to fight those monsters. But his mother, at this moment, while she was washing the dishes, started to say what happened. That his father was also running brokenly to the challenge, even while eating, and she will help him to get ready. And at this time, the sister heard their conversation, and she could not hold back her tears, covered her face with a blanket. She was lying in her room when suddenly she heard someone open the door and Jin Woo walked in. He asked her if she was asleep, to which she only nodded her head. He offered to talk to her, but she refused, saying she wanted to sleep. He didn't care and sat down beside her on the bed, not knowing where to start this conversation. He started to talk about how he had almost died recently. However, he suddenly realized he had said something wrong, turned to her and started talking again about what he wanted to say. He explained that this was a common thing for him, but this time he barely remembered, because it was too dangerous out there. Despite that, he survived and is grateful to fate for being able to go home despite all the obstacles. So this time he is also going to return. He reached out his hand and put it on his sister's head and told her that he was grateful to her for having her and for worrying about him, and wanted him to stay, But his sister started crying because she couldn't hold back the tears and started telling him that he was going to go there anyway. Jin Woo replied that he would come back. So she shouldn't cry because he would always look after his sister wherever he was, and the next day the president of the association wanted to make a statement. And a lot of reporters sat there with big cameras and filmed everything that was going on. What was in that room, and when Jin Woo came out and told what he had in mind. After that, they shook hands with the president, the Hand Association. A few hours later, at the nearest airport, Jinho was carrying a large bag of equipment. He saw his mentor standing in front of him scratching his head. From this, he realized that his partner was running late. A little while later, Jinho and the Ajin Guild traveled to their dream where they could glorify their guild. The next day in Japan, many soldiers were evacuating civilians. One of the soldiers started to tell the doctors that they could not take all the wounded, only 3 or 4 people. But this man didn't understand why they couldn't, because there were still 10 patients left who couldn't move on their own. He began to explain that now was not the time to worry about those who already had 1 foot in the grave. The giants were walking everywhere and only death awaited them here. But that man couldn't abandon his patients, and his wife doted on protecting them at all costs, and the soldier began to say that since this is the case, he too will stay here. He couldn't leave the civilians and avoid it like the last coward. He wanted to shelter all the wounded somewhere and then figure out what would happen next. But suddenly they saw huge giants starting to come out from around the corner of the house and devouring the soldiers, and everyone started shooting at them. They didn't care about those bullets and they wanted to swat them like ants. That soldier wanted to drag the doctor away with him, but suddenly some huge shadow hit one of the giants with all its strength, from which it began to fly away for several hundred meters and crushed with its fall all the houses that were in the area. The soldier raised his head and could not understand what had happened. As soon as he raised his head, he saw in front of him that a shadowy soldier was standing in his place, and he was so huge that his height could match the giants that the soldiers were killing. He couldn't understand what was going on, but suddenly he saw a guy walking past him, and the guy started telling him that it was dangerous here and we should get the other giant away from the hospital. At this time, rocks started falling from the building and flying straight at the citizens, but Jinho got there just in time and started covering the doctors with his big shield, telling them to pull themselves together as he would be evacuating them out of here. Jinho started to tell Jin Woo that he would help the fences and he should deal with all the monsters that are walking around nearby. As soon as Jin Woo heard this, he started giving orders to his shadow soldiers to immediately attack the giants that are walking around nearby. And as soon as his huge shadow soldier hit a large giant and knocked it to the ground, Jin Woo started to act and ran towards it. As soon as he jumped on his shadow soldier, he jumped even higher. With a swing of his blade, he sliced the giant in half. But at this time, the hunters in the eastern United States who were in the building began to say that they had learned that Jin Woo had gone to Japan. They heard that the lady had never been able to help him in any way. The other hunters sitting around the table began to say that death awaited him in Tokyo then. After all, everyone here was able to unleash their abilities thanks to that woman, and thus they should realize that usually a hunter has a limit. One of the guys started to say that he remembered that Jin Woo was so stubborn with his strength that he didn't even realize the whole situation. Did he really think that ants and giants were the same thing? A hunter who overestimates his strength is doomed to perish. And who knew the island would be his last? One of the hunters started putting his life on the line, thinking he would die on the first day, and another bet his house that he would die in 2 days. Then the guild leader said that he was betting all of the Seekers Guild buildings that he would come back alive. He would rather focus on the S-rank 8 that had recently appeared in their territory, and as early as tomorrow, they should be opening up. I wonder how many of them will survive. One of the hunters thought about how this man knew how to ruin the mood, but the other hunter replied to give him a shove. He'd always been a jerk, but his head was brighter now in Japan than it was in America, which would be opening tomorrow, and realized it was going to be hot here too. The battle continued in Japan, and the city was plunged into chaos. After all, there were shadow soldiers fighting against huge giants, and the reporters who flew in a helicopter were filming the whole thing. Otherwise, it would be hard to believe the viewers if they were told what was going on. Recognized soldier hunter Jin Woo started attacking the giant, and now he is in their trap. The ants have caught the giant and are now devouring it. Meanwhile on the ground, a little girl was running away from one of the giants and he was about to almost grab her. But suddenly a shadow appeared and cut off the hand of this giant. It was the commander-in-chief hunter Jin Woo, whose name was Igris. He saved that girl by taking her in his arms. But at that moment, another shadow appeared above that big giant. It was Iron, who flew straight at him. And with all his might he struck him on the head with his axe. As a result, the giant fell to the ground and stopped moving. The girl who was in the hands of the shadow soldier and Igris was very scared and watched as he went crazy standing on the dead soul of the giant. As soon as the shadow soldier saw this little girl, he began to smile and immediately Igris stroked her head, thus showing that she was now safe. However, Jin Woo, who was standing nearby, watched as Iron, after leveling up, was having a blast and was doing a good job in spite of that. Suddenly, he noticed a soldier who approached him and started to thank him. But the hunter, Jin Woo, didn't know English and extended his hand to him, showing his big ring finger, and started to say to him, "You good, shave, soldier." The soldier was confused, but responded by saying thank you to the hunter for helping him. Jin Woo turned around and started telling his partner, Jin Ho, to start getting this soldier out of here and finish with the evacuation. Once Jin Ho understood, he started to lead the soldier away, but Jin Woo realized that he was now ready to start the real show and started lifting the dead giant to turn him into a shadow soldier. While Jin Woo was busy turning giants into his soldiers, at this time in one publication, some men started calling their chairman and telling him that the return was successful and the giant's corpse had been discovered. But the chairman couldn't understand how this was possible, and suddenly when he looked at the surveillance camera he realized that Gato was right. And it was the same look he had seen at the airport when he had met countless hunters. But there was a lot of power in his gaze. Then, at the airport, he started talking and greeted the hunter who had come to help him and began to explain that they had this very urgent matter. He got straight to the point and began to say that the giants were now heading in their direction and they were asking him to take care of the defense of Osaka City. After all, he realized that no matter how strong this hunter was, he still wouldn't be able to stand up to all these giants. And while he would be busy defending, they would have time to negotiate with other countries. And then Jin Woo told him that he didn't want to do that. To which the chairman started to ask him that in that case, what does he plan to do? The chairman had been thinking about it all this time and realized that he was in all seriousness going to go up against all these giants alone. And what he's doing now, isn't that what he was originally supposed to do? At this time, Jin Woo was looking into the eyes of the huge giant he had turned into his shadow soldier. And since there were quite a few of them, and to avoid calling them by name, he decided to have them numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. But then General Bear came up and started saying that they had eliminated another enemy and he would be number 6. Jin Woo thought to himself that he should use deception and start building an army right away. He turned to his partner, Jin Ho, who was standing near the tent, and started to tell him to get ready and he would be back soon. Jin Woo realized that it was easy. But the most important things would only begin now, and the shadow soldiers he had sent all over Japan helped the hunters take down the giants. Without the losing strategy of having enough mana, the giants, who had already had time to use up their strength in the meantime, couldn't field against his soldiers. However, the problem was that the appearance of this level 7 dungeon would be followed by other outbreaks. Because of this, in addition to the giants, other monsters also occupied the city, and one has to deal with both evacuation and defense at the same time. On the 7th day after the dungeon burst, at night, Jin Woo was walking along the road with his partner, Jin Ho. They highlighted the real ruins that were everywhere in this city. Suddenly, they met a girl hunter who asked that they had finally arrived. To which Jin Woo started to ask her why he hadn't noticed any other hunters here. She replied that as of now, there was no one else in Tokyo but her. And right now, it was impossible to even calculate the damage to their city, and the monsters had already scattered all over the country. 17 rank hunters, including him, 16 people, 6 Japanese, 2 Chinese, 3 from Canada, and 1 each from England and India were involved. 2 groups of 6 were formed from the survivors. Among the dead are Yuri Orlov, Hanzawa Gokiai, Fear and Lucas from Canada. This is the result of prolonged fights and the fact that the monsters acting alone are fewer in number, but each of them is a level higher than a Class A dungeon boss. Jin Woo realized that if 3 high-ranked ones had already died, there was no reason to think that the A-ranked ones would be able to defeat them. And they said that there were 13 individuals of the giants, and one of them was now moving through the sea towards China. The huntress started to say that there weren't enough people to mop up at least Japan, but thanks to Jin Woo, most of the giants were wiped out and the remaining one is now being dealt with by the hunters and his shadow soldiers. After saying that, Jin Woo realized and started to say that it turns out that the only one left was the one that was now right in front of them, the one guarding the gate. But suddenly, Jin Woo turned his attention to the burning city and began to think that it seemed like he had seen this somewhere before, but he didn't realize where, and there was no fire. But there was the same devastated city, like the devil's abode. If this was all intended by the system, what did the creator want to say with all this? After all, he was already dead and gone. And there was no way to know now if his body was even real, even if it was a hint of what was coming in the future. Jin Woo realized that he just needed to prevent all of this from happening. After all, that's what this power was given to him for, and he doesn't want to shake in front of an enemy he can't handle. That's why he's been searching for strength all this time. That's why he came here. And as soon as Jin Woo finished thinking, he started to speak. He realized that he had realized that everyone was gathered, and now they could begin. The huntress started to say that the other hunters weren't done yet. To this, Jin Woo told her that no, everyone was done. And at that same moment, all the hunters finished fighting. The girl who was lying on one of the giants was sighing heavily, for she was very tired and it was pissing her off. But the other hunter began to tell her that if it was pissing her off, she should still be glad that it was over, and she should think more positively. She realized it herself, the fact that they had just spit and dealt with the giants they couldn't even lay a finger on. Now, as if nothing had happened, they were drowning in Tokyo. But she remained angry and pounded her fist against the ground, starting to tell her partner that they were telling them they were only good for cleaning. And she was really pissed off at these summoned shadow soldiers that were all over the neighborhood watching this. Most of the shadow soldiers started to prepare for something bigger, and the huntress girl who was next to Jin Woo saw that there were many shadow soldiers gathered around her who were ready to fight. And the last one that came up in time and started flying from afar landed beside Jin Woo. It was General Bear, and Jin Woo turned around to him and began to say that he had finally arrived, for he had done a good job now. To which Bear thanked his king. Jin Woo began to tell Genho that he and Mrs. Hanakawa should move far away. As soon as they ran away to the side, Jin Woo called out to his 6 giants who were standing in front. And at that very second, Jin Woo ordered his army to go on the attack. And the shouts of the shadow soldiers began to sound, as they rushed into battle, ready to destroy whoever would stand in their way. Hundreds of thousands of shadow soldiers began to run towards the portal, sharing the strongest giant, and Jin Woo's army, which was so large that half the city was plunged into darkness. And at that moment, this big giant, who had been sitting in the same place all the time, began to open his fierce and red eyes, for he saw that a huge enemy army was approaching him. And as soon as he swung his great sword, hundreds of shadow soldiers began to die. And at that very second, that giant began to move towards them, thus throwing them back hundreds of thousands of meters. He seemed to cut through the shadow soldiers with his immense strength, and Jin Woo, who was watching this, realized that he simply had a terrifying power. After all, he was destroying as many as 100 enemies with a single strike, and yet he was still very huge. There was such magical power emanating from him that his first thought was to run away as soon as possible. And that was a problem, because Jin Woo didn't understand how to fight it at all. And there were only 2 ways to deal with it: run away, forget and move on, or get rid of it right now. After all, that big giant would scatter all the shadow soldiers with a single swing of his big sword. Well, no matter how much he fought back, the shadow soldiers were much bigger and the ant army that was near his foot started to devour him. But suddenly, he noticed it and lifted his foot up. By doing so, he threw all the sparrows back hundreds of meters. General Bear, who was standing beside Jin Woo, right now wanted to rush into this terrifying battle, but in Jin Woo's arms, Jin Woo stopped him. After all, he knew that it was still early, and while everything was predictable, he knew that he needed to hold Manu back. After all, it would take a lot more effort to find his weak spot. Jin Woo watched then as his shadow soldiers fought with all their might against that huge monster, and his mana very quickly began to evaporate. Jin Woo began to realize that the magic of that giant was surrounding him like an iron wall, and that was why he wasn't using himself as a defense, and that was why he was so confident. Jin Woo noticed during the battle that he did block once, and at that very moment, he ordered his dragon to act. They started to rise into the air and flew towards that big giant. As soon as they got close to it, Jin Woo ordered his general to go forward and wait for his command as they flew closer and closer. But Burr misunderstood at that very second and started attacking that giant. At this time, Iris, who was on the dragon Kaisel, climbed even higher and started using his sword. He struck the giant with a large lightning bolt, but it deflected in time. At the same second, Jin Woo sprang into action and jumped off of Kaisel straight at the giant. But Igris continued to act anyway. Apparently not liking the fact that he dodged after his first and second attacks. He jumped straight at him, and while that giant started swinging his sword, Igris was already on his body. The giant noticed that he was getting closer to him and started to attack him again with that big lightning bolt that hit his face, but he managed to block it with his big hand. But at that time, Jin Woo appeared and struck him in the eye, causing that monster to start screaming. Jin Woo realized that he was right after all, protecting only his face. At this time, Bear began to divert the giant's attention to himself, and Jin Woo began to use the monarch's power, growing stronger and lighting up with violently bright colors. And in that same second, he started to launch many attacks on the face of that big giant Jinho, who was standing hunter and observing that it didn't look like a battle between a hunter and a monster, but rather a battle between two monsters.